Hey everybody, it's Alex with Engineering Applied. We're going to be accelerating your career, hobby, or business with this overview of the available Coil tool found within Autodesk Inventor. If you want more easy to understand and practical content made by an experienced engineer like myself, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any helpful content like this in the future. If you're looking for specific functions, check the description for timestamps, and if you don't find what you're looking for in this video, make sure you check out my other videos in the Autodesk Inventor tutorial series because I'm confident you'll find exactly what you're looking for. Let's get started. Okay, to demonstrate the Coil tool and its options, we'll be creating a spring found at the end of a retractable ballpoint pen. So I know you all are familiar with this type of pen. At the end of this pen, there's a little spring that allows for that action to work. And I want to connect this lesson with a real life example. I firmly believe this helps with the retention of the information, and it helps you make that transition and applying this information to your job or your projects that you're doing, or something new that you're making for your business. So to get started, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into a blank part file, and we'll go through all of the options found for the Coil tool, and we'll create this spring and its variable pitch characteristics. Okay, here we are in our blank part file. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to create some sketch geometry in which to reference the Coil function off of. So the Coil function needs two things. It needs a cross-section shape, and then it needs an axis in which to rotate that Coil feature around. So we're going to create a 2D sketch. In this case, I'm just going to use the XY plane. This is completely arbitrary. It just depends on where you want to take the design and what you want to do with it. So what I'll do here is I'll create a circle at the origin, and the circle is going to be 0.016 inches. It's a small diameter. It's a small gauge wire. Okay, so we're going to hit OK, and we are going to finish the sketch. And then now we need to create a second sketch with a vertical axis in which we dimension the diameter of this coil off of. So we'll create a second sketch. We're going to use the XY plane once more. And I'm just going to drop a line somewhere out here, making sure that it's vertically positioned. And we're going to set that as construction. Okay. Now let's dimension this. So we have the radius or the diameter of our spring. In this case, I want it to be 0.073 for the radius off of the center point of the coil cross section. So we'll set that. And then we'll go ahead and click OK and finish that sketch. Okay, you notice that I have everything fully defined like we typically like to do in our sketches. And we go up to the Coil tool. Okay, now we're in our Coil tool. And before we jump into the actual execution of this command, I want to talk about some of the menu options along the top here. So the first tab you see up here is the Properties tab. And if I were to click this X, it would actually close out of the Coil command. So if I click that X, we jump out of the Coil command. We'll jump back into the Coil command. You have a little plus sign here so you can add your iLogic panes or your favorites panes where you can access your Content Center library. In this case, we don't need that. We're moving along the top here to the Advanced Settings menu. Now, there's some options found in this Advanced Settings menu that's common with the Extrude function, the Revolve function, and some of the others that create 3D geometry. So if you're familiar with those, you can go ahead and skip this part. If not, this applies to those other options as well. So the first option is the Keep Sketch Visible On. And for this option, what this essentially says is when this is checked off and we have our feature selected, and I use this plus sign to execute the feature, it will keep the Coil command open and it will keep the original sketch geometry that's referenced for this feature active. So I'll just demonstrate that now. I hit the plus sign and you'll notice it keeps that original profile at the end there active, and then it keeps the window open for me to continue using this feature over and over again. So just depending on what you're trying to do here, if this helps improve the speed of your workflow, by all means use this. So that is available to you there. We're going to hit cancel. We're going to jump back into Coil. Okay, so we are in our Coil command, and let's jump back up to this Advanced Settings menu. The next option is the Hide Presets option. So essentially all this does is it hides this little presets menu up here. So if I click that, it goes away. Let's show that again. And let's move down to the single enter to finish command. We'll get back to the presets here in just a moment. So essentially when this is active, all this says is all I have to do is hit the enter key once after entering a value to finish this command. So I'll give you an example of that. So let's go ahead and make sure our axis is selected. So it populates that. And let's say I want something with 5 revolutions. Well, I type in a 5, and when I hit enter once, it finishes the command. If I uncheck that, I have to hit command twice to actually, finish and exit out of the coil function. So just depending on what setting configurations you like and how you like to work, you can play around with that as needed. So we'll go back to coil once more. Now let's talk about presets for a minute. So presets allow us to create a custom option that if we commonly use this option, it allows us to quickly access it. So let me give you an example of this. So say, for example, it's common for us to create this particular spring profile. So it has a pitch of 0.087 inches and it has 5 revolutions. So maybe this is a standard piece of hardware or standard feature that we commonly create. So what we can do is we can go along the top and let's just call this default coil. Okay, we hit the little check mark. And so we've created our new preset with these parameters. And if we pull this drop down open, you'll notice that we have our no preset option. So we could select that. We could go to our last use. So that'll default to the last use preset, or we could go to whatever custom profiles that we created here. So now let's say, for example, you want to edit this, as in you want to save it, you want to rename it, you want to delete it, whatever. You can go over to this preset settings option and you have options to, again, save, rename, or delete. You can change the sort order in that little drop down menu and so on and so forth. So in this particular case, we don't really want to create a default of this profile. So what we can do is we can go ahead and delete that. Make sure the preset of interest is already selected before you click the delete option. So we go to delete current. And now if we go back to our menu, it's no longer there. Now you'll notice there's a little blue cube up in the top right corner. This is to signify that we are in our solid mode. And essentially what this says is when we execute this command, it creates a solid body. Now, if we go back and change that, it switches to surface mode. So again, if we execute this, it creates surface geometry instead of a solid body. Okay. Moving right along here. Our next section is the input geometry section. So this is where we select the geometrical elements in our axis geometry that we begin to create this coil off of. So this first option up here is the profiles option. So what this does is we want to select our cross section that we want to create the coil out of. So in this case, our cross section shape is that circle that I began to draw in that first sketch. The second option is the axis option. And to make sure this is selected, you'll see a little thin blue line. So if I click in here, you'll see that blue line up here. That means it's ready to select a profile. Down here, it's ready to select an axis. So we'll go ahead and select this center axis that we created to revolve around. So now you can see why I was referring to that construction line as our radius for the coil option, because in this case, it is centered to that coil feature. Okay, now you'll see these 2 little arrows here. These 2 arrows is to allow us to reverse the pitch direction. So if I click that, it's going to invert the direction that the coil function executes in. So in this case, I actually want it in the original orientation because we want to go in the positive Y direction. Okay, so the next section is behavior section. And the first option within the behavior section allows us to control exactly how we are creating the coil feature. So we have these 4 options here. The first one is pitch and revolution. So this allows us to control the coil based off of the pitch or the distance between the turns in the coil and how many revolutions or how many turns we have in the coil itself. The next option is revolution and height. So that allows us to control the coil based off of how many turns or revolutions we have in the coil and how high that coil segment goes. The next one is pitch and height. So we control it based off the distance between the turns and how high the overall coil goes. And then spiral. Spiral just flattens out the profile onto a plane and just creates a flat coil there. Okay, so let's go back to revolution and height, because that's how we're going to start off our pin spring design. So the next option that we're going to take a look here for our design is the revolution count. Again, this controls how many turns you have in your coil feature. And in this case, we want to have 2 turns in the coil, and we want it to occupy a height of 0.055 inches. Okay, one thing I want to point out is at the end of these fields, we have these little arrows that we can click to pick up various feature dimensions to use as a value in this space. So I can measure something. Maybe it's a height of an edge in the part somewhere that I want to model. So maybe I have a flat edge somewhere in the part that's 0.055 inches and I want this to be identical to that. I can click measure, pick up that part, and it'll mirror that onto this height section. We can also select a feature dimension as well, and then some previously used values that we may have used in the past for quick selection if we don't quite remember what it was off the top of our heads. Now, moving down, we have our taper section. So now we have a 0 degree taper, but let's put a 45 degree taper in there just to see what happens. So if we put a positive value, it's going to expand the end of the coil outwards. And if I put a negative value, so let's say negative 15 degrees, for example, and you'll see the end of that coil sort of tapers inwards at 15 degrees. If you've ever seen the soldering pin holders where it's like a coiled wire where it starts larger on the front end and tapers down to a smaller end, this would be a practical use for this particular option. And there's tons of other stuff out there that you might use the taper option for, but that's the taper itself. So we're going to set that back to 0. Next, we have our rotation option. So we can have a left-hand rotation or a right-hand rotation. So in this case, we want to leave it as a right-hand rotation, but if I were to click left-hand, it would just reverse that for us. We have our selector style drop down box. So we can either get icons as our selector style or a drop down menu. So if I change that to drop down, it changes this to a little drop down menu. Okay. So I'm going to actually change this back to icons because that's what I personally prefer. The next 2 options, which are currently checked, typically start out unchecked. So you have close start and close end. So let's say, for example, on our coil, we want the start or the end to be flattened out or tapered to some angle. In our case, we actually want to do that because we want flat ends on our coil so that it sets on the ledges in our pin as designed. So in this case, we actually want to close the start of the spring. So we're just going to click close start. And you notice that it sort of flattened out the start of this coil. So let me just go back and redo that for you real quick. So we uncheck it, it opens up the end of the spring. We close it, it flattens that out so it can sit nicely on whatever ledge or step that we have in our part. And then you could change the flat angle. So we could change that to something a little bit more shallow, so maybe 25 degrees, or maybe we want to keep it at 90. In this case, we want to keep it at 90. And then we can also change our transition. So again, we can go to a shallower angle and it just opens up that transition angle a little bit, and so on and so forth. So we'll just close that back down again. Okay, so we're at our parameters we need for the start of the spring. So we're going to hit OK. Now, the next segment is we want to use a different method or behavior option to create the middle section of the spring. So what I'm going to do to create a smooth transition between the starting segment and the middle section is I'm going to actually create a sketch right on the face where the spring ends. And this is a trick you can use with a lot of different features. So we'll go ahead and just create a 2D sketch on this face. Okay. And I'm just going to project the geometry of that cross section. So I just clicked project geometry, click the edge and hit OK. Okay. So now we're going to just click finish sketch and we're going to move back up to coil. Now, it wants us to select an axis, but we no longer have an axis there. You don't have to redraw this. What you can do is you can open up the dropdown for the original coil, and we're going to go back and select the sketch 2 for our axis, and we're going to right click and go to visibility. So now it's visible. We can go back into coil again, select that original axis and recycle it. And now we're going to set our parameters for this. So we're going to use pitch and revolution for this one because we want to control it based on the pitch of the spring and then how many turns in the spring we have. So for our pitch, we're going to select 0.087 inches and we want to have 10 revolutions or turns in the spring. So we're going to just verify that looks okay to us. And for this segment, we're going to actually close the start and the end, and I'll explain more why as we move along. But just to give you a brief snapshot of that, if we leave this unchecked and hit OK. And then we look at this transition here between the initial section. It's not quite a fluid transition between the closed section here in the start and this open section at the end here and at the beginning of the separate segment. So what we want to do is we actually want to go back into this as an option, and we want to close the start. And since the other side of the spring is essentially what we started on this side, we want to go ahead and hit closed in and make sure everything's at 90 degrees because I want a smooth transition there. And one thing I want to talk about here, now that we're back in the menu, is the output section. So you see our Boolean operations. This works exactly the same as it does in the extrude and revolve functions that you may have seen before. And the first option that we're typically going to use is join. So when join is selected and we hit OK, and just notice briefly that that angle is more flattened out and it's more of a smooth transition as it goes up. But anyways, so join essentially combines all of these features into the single solid body. So if we select that solid body in our model tree, everything gets selected simultaneously. So that shows that it's a single solid body. Well, what if we want it as separate solid bodies, or what if we want to do something different? So let's go back and let's actually update this again. Okay, so if we go to cut, let's say, for example, I have some sort of shape, maybe a block or something. I can actually cut this profile that's coiled out of that solid block if I want to do that. To demonstrate the cut command, I went ahead and just modeled up a solid block here, and we're going to keep this coil going up through the solid block. So we'll just go back to our 3D model area, click coil, select our original axis, and we're going to just change this Boolean operation to cut, and we'll just click OK so you can see what happens. So now you'll see that I cut that coil into this shape. So if I go to view and then just take the section of this, just draw it in here. Oops, went a little too far there. You'll see that the coil cut through that middle section of the block. So we'll go ahead and jump back a couple steps. So now let's look at the other command, which is intersect. So we'll go to coil, select the axis, change it to intersect, and click OK. That only keeps the intersection point between the coil and that block profile. Let's jump back once more and we'll go back into coil. The next option is new solid. So if I select that, what's going to happen is when I create this new segment, it's going to be a separate solid body from the original coil piece and from the solid block up here. So if I hit OK and I hover over it, it's a separate solid body. And now if I go to solid 1, it includes the original beginning of the coil and the solid block because I didn't designate it as a separate solid body at that step. But if I go to solid 2, it highlights this segment of the coil as its own separate entity. So this is a really neat way to control how many solid bodies you have in your part and sort of how you want that laid out. Resuming our original operation for this middle section of the spring, I went ahead and deleted that extruded block. We don't need that anymore. And we're just going to click this axis, make sure this is set to join because I want each segment of the spring to all be one solid body. And I'm going to make sure the close start and close end is activated so that we have a smooth transition between the each segment of the spring from the open parts with the larger pitch to the smaller pitch sections. So we're going to click OK. Now let's jump to the last section here that we have to create. So we're going to create another closed end like we do have on this side. Let's create our final sketch. So we're going to go to Start 2D Sketch, click on this exposed face of the middle coil section. And we're just going to project the geometry of this face here. Click OK and finish 2D Sketch. Go to Coil, select the axis we want to rotate around. And we just want to make sure our method is set to revolution and height. So we want to control this as 2 revolutions or 2 turns in this coil segment with a height of 0.055 inches with a 0-degree taper. This all looks good. And then for our options down here, we actually want to leave it as a closed end because we want the end of this coil, so the top end of this coil, to be flat so it sets on the step in our pin casing properly, but we're going to leave close start unchecked because we want it to be a smooth transition between the end section and the middle section. So this all looks good to me. Just make sure your Boolean operation is set to join, so it's a single solid body. Click OK. And there we go. Now we have our completed spring for our retractable ballpoint pen. So again, you see our smaller pitch section on the ends so that it sets on our step properly. And then we have our middle section. That concludes this segment of the Autodesk Inventor part creation module, where we took a look at the available Coil tool. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications to stay up to date on future content that will help you reach your goals along your journey. And of course, don't hesitate to leave a comment or reach out via my website contact page and let me know if there's anything else you'd like to learn about or see on this channel. I love sharing my knowledge and experience with the community, and I cannot wait to see all of the amazing things you'll be doing out in the world with this information. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.